Preface. The Buddha's discourses preserved in the Pali canon are called suttas, the Pali equivalent of the Sanskrit word sutras. Although the Pali canon belongs to a particular Buddhist school, the Theravada, or School of the Elders, the suttas are by no means exclusively Theravada Buddhist texts. They stem from the earliest period of Buddhist literary history, a period lasting roughly 100 years after the Buddha's death, before the original Buddhist community divided into different schools. The Pali Suttas have counterparts from other early Buddhist schools now extinct, texts sometimes strikingly similar to the Pali version, differing mainly in settings and arrangement, but not in points of doctrine. The suttas, along with their counterparts, thus constitute the most ancient records of the Buddha's teachings available to us. They are the closest we can come to what the historical Buddha Gautama himself actually taught. The teachings found in them have served as the fountainhead, the primal source for all the evolving streams of Buddhist doctrine and practice through the centuries. For this reason, they constitute the common heritage of the entire Buddhist tradition, and Buddhists of all schools who wish to understand the taproot of Buddhism should make a close and careful study of them a priority. In the Pali canon, the Buddha's discourses are preserved in collections called Nikayas. Over the past 20 years, fresh translations of the 4 major Nikayas have appeared in print, issued in attractive and affordable editions. Wisdom Publications pioneered this development in 1987 when it published Maurice Walsh's translation of the Digha Nikaya, the long discourses of the Buddha. Wisdom followed this precedent by bringing out in 1995 my revised and edited version of Bhikkhu Nyanamuli's handwritten translation of the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourses of the Buddha, followed in 2000 by my new translation of the complete Samyutta Nikaya, the connected discourses of the Buddha. In 1999, under the imprint of the Sacred Literature Trust series, Altamira Press published an anthology of suttas from the Anguttara Nikaya, translated by the late Nyanaponika Thera and myself, titled Numerical Discourses of the Buddha. I am currently working on a new translation of the entire Anguttara Nikaya, intended for Wisdom Publications' Teachings of the Buddha series. Many who have read these larger works have told me, to my satisfaction, that the translations brought the suttas to life for them. Yet others who earnestly sought to enter the deep ocean of the Nikayas told me something else. They said that while the language of the translations made them far more accessible than earlier translations, they were still grappling for a standpoint from which to see the suttas' overall structure, a framework within which they all fit together. The Nikayas themselves do not offer much help in this respect, for their arrangement, with the notable exception of the Samyutta Nikaya, which does have a thematic structure, appears almost haphazard. In an ongoing series of lectures I began giving at Bodhi Monastery in New Jersey in January 2003, I devised a scheme of my own to organize the contents of the Majjhima Nikaya. This scheme unfolds the Buddha's message progressively, from the simple to the difficult, from the elementary to the profound. Upon reflection, I saw that this scheme could be applied not only to the Majjhima Nikaya, but to the 4 Nikayas as a whole. The present book organizes suttas selected from all 4 Nikayas within this thematic and progressive framework. This book is intended for 2 types of readers. The first are those not yet acquainted with the Buddha's discourses, who feel the need for a systematic introduction. For such readers, any of the Nikayas is bound to appear opaque. All of them, viewed at once, may seem like a jungle, entangling and bewildering, full of unknown beasts, or like the great ocean, vast, tumultuous, and forbidding. I hope that this book will serve as a map to help them wend their way through the jungle of the suttas, or as a sturdy ship to carry them across the ocean of the Dhamma. The second type of readers for whom this book is meant are those already acquainted with the suttas, who still cannot see how they fit together into an intelligible whole. For such readers, individual suttas may be comprehensible in themselves, but the texts in their totality appear like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle scattered across a table. Once one understands the scheme in this book, one should come away with a clear idea of the architecture of the teaching. Then, with a little reflection, one should be able to determine the place any sutta occupies in the edifice of the Dhamma, whether or not it has been included in this anthology. This anthology, or any other anthology of suttas, is no substitute for the Nikayas themselves. My hope is twofold, corresponding to the two types of readers for whom this volume is designed. 1. That newcomers to early Buddhist literature find this volume whets their appetite for more and encourages them to take the plunge into the full Nikayas. And 2. That experienced readers of the Nikayas finish the book with a better understanding of material with which they are already familiar. If this anthology is meant to make any other point, it is to convey the sheer breadth and range of the Buddha's wisdom. While early Buddhism is sometimes depicted as a discipline of world renunciation intended primarily for ascetics and contemplatives, the ancient discourses of the Pali Canon clearly show us how the Buddha's wisdom and compassion reached into the very depths of mundane life, providing ordinary people with guidelines for proper conduct and right understanding. Far from being a creed for a monastic elite, ancient Buddhism involved the close collaboration of householders and monastics in the twin tasks of maintaining the Buddha's teachings and assisting one another in their efforts to walk the path to the extinction of suffering. To fulfill these tasks meaningfully, the Dhamma had to provide them with deep and inexhaustible guidance, inspiration, joy, and consolation. It could never have done this if it had not directly addressed their earnest efforts to combine social and family obligations with an aspiration to realize the highest. Almost all the passages included in this book have been selected from the above-mentioned publications of the four Nikayas. Almost all have undergone revisions, usually slight, but sometimes major, to accord with my own evolving understanding of the texts and the Pali language. I have newly translated a small number of suttas from the Anguttara Nikaya not included in the above-mentioned anthology. I have also included a handful of suttas from the Udana and Itivuttaka, two small books belonging to the fifth Nikaya, the Khuddaka Nikaya, the minor or miscellaneous collection. I have based these on John D. Ireland's translation, published by the Buddhist Publication Society in Sri Lanka. But again, I have freely modified them to fit my own preferred diction and terminology. I have given preference to suttas in prose over those in verse, as being more direct and explicit. When a sutta concludes with verses, if these merely restate the preceding prose, in the interest of space I have omitted them. Each chapter begins with an introduction, in which I explain the salient concepts relevant to the theme of the chapter, and try to show how the texts I have chosen exemplify that theme. To clarify points arising from both the introductions and the texts, I have included endnotes. These often draw upon the classical commentaries to the Nikayas, ascribed to the great South Indian commentator, Acharya Buddhaghosa, who worked in Sri Lanka in the 5th century CE. For the sake of concision, I have not included as many notes in this book as I have in my other translations of the Nikayas. These notes are also not as technical as those in the full translations. References to the sources follow each selection. References to texts from the Dikha Nikaya and the Majjhima Nikaya cite the number and name of the sutta in Pali. Passages from these two collections retain the paragraph numbers used in the long discourses of the Buddha and the middle-length discourses of the Buddha. So readers who wish to locate these passages within the full translations can easily do so. References to texts from the Samyutta Nikaya cite Samyutta and Sutta number. Texts from the Anguttara Nikaya cite Nipata and Sutta number. The ones and the twos also cite chapters within the Nipata followed by the Sutta number. References to texts from the Udana cite Nipata and Sutta number. Texts from the Itvutaka cite simply the Sutta number. All references are followed by the volume and page number in the Pali Text Society's standard edition of these works. I am grateful to Timothy McNeill and David Kittlestrom of Wisdom Publications for urging me to persist with this project in the face of long periods of indifferent health. Samanera Analayo and Bhikkhu Jnana Sobhano read and commented on my introductions, and John Kelly reviewed proofs of the entire book. All three made useful suggestions, for which I am grateful. John Kelly also prepared the table of sources that appears at the back of the book. Finally, I am grateful to my students of Pali and Dhamma studies at Bodhi Monastery for their enthusiastic interest in the teachings of the Nikayas, which inspired me to compile this anthology. I am especially thankful to the monastery's extraordinary founder, Ven Master Jen Chun, for welcoming a monk of another Buddhist tradition to his monastery, and for his interest in bridging the northern and southern transmissions of the early Buddhist teachings. Bhikkhu Bodhi. General Introduction. Uncovering the structure of the teaching. Though his teaching is highly systematic, there is no single text that can be ascribed to the Buddha in which he defines the architecture of the Dhamma, the scaffolding upon which he has framed his specific expressions of the doctrine. In the course of his long ministry, the Buddha taught in different ways as determined by occasion and circumstances. Sometimes he would enunciate invariable principles that stand at the heart of the teaching. Sometimes he would adapt the teaching to accord with the proclivities and aptitudes of the people who came to him for guidance. Sometimes he would adjust his exposition to fit a situation that required a particular response. But, throughout the collections of texts that have come down to us as authorized word of the Buddha, we do not find a single sutta, a single discourse, in which the Buddha has drawn together all the elements of his teaching and assigned them to their appropriate place within some comprehensive system. While in a literature culture in which systematic thought is highly prized, the lack of such a text with a unifying function might be viewed as a defect. In an entirely oral culture, as was the culture in which the Buddha lived and moved, the lack of a descriptive key to the Dhamma would hardly be considered significant. Within this culture, neither teacher nor student aimed at conceptual completeness. The teacher did not intend to present a complete system of ideas. His pupils did not aspire to learn a complete system of ideas. The aim that united them in the process of learning, the process of transmission, was that of practical training, self-transformation, the realization of truth, and unshakable liberation of the mind. This does not mean, however, that the teaching was always expediently adapted to the situation at hand. At times, the Buddha would present more panoramic views of the Dhamma that united many components of the path in a graded or wide-ranging structure. But though there are several discourses that exhibit a broad scope, they still do not embrace all elements of the Dhamma in one overreaching scheme. The purpose of the present book is to develop and exemplify such a scheme. I here attempt to provide a comprehensive picture of the Buddha's teaching that incorporates a wide variety of suttas into an organic structure. This structure, I hope, will bring to light the intentional pattern underlying the Buddha's formulation of the Dhamma, and thus provide the reader with guidelines for understanding early Buddhism as a whole. I have selected the suttas almost entirely from the 4 major collections or Nikayas of the Pali Canon, though I have also included a few texts from the Udana and the Itivutaka, 2 small books of the 5th collection, the Khuddaka Nikaya. Each chapter opens with its own introduction, in which I explain the basic concepts of early Buddhism that the texts exemplify, and show how the texts give expression to these ideas. I will briefly supply background information about the Nikayas later in this introduction. First, however, I want to outline the scheme that I have devised to organize the suttas. Although my particular use of this scheme may be original, it is not sheer innovation, but is based upon a threefold distinction that the Pali commentaries make among the types of benefits to which the practice of the Dhamma leads. 1. Welfare and happiness visible in this present life. 2. Welfare and happiness pertaining to future lives. And 3. The ultimate good, Nibbana, Sanskrit, Nirvana. 3 preliminary chapters are designed to lead up to those that embody this threefold scheme. Chapter 1 is a survey of the human condition as it is apart from the appearance of a Buddha in the world. Perhaps this was the way human life appeared to the Bodhisattva, the future Buddha, as he dwelled in the Tusita heaven, gazing down upon the earth, awaiting the appropriate occasion to descend and take his final birth. We behold a world in which human beings are driven helplessly toward old age and death, in which they are spun around by circumstances, so that they are oppressed by bodily pain, cast down by failure and misfortune, made anxious and fearful by change and deterioration. It is a world in which people aspire to live in harmony, but in which their untamed emotions repeatedly compel them, against their better judgment, to lock horns in conflicts that escalate into violence and wholesale devastation. Finally, taking the broadest view of all, it is a world in which sentient beings are propelled forward by their own ignorance and craving, from one life to the next, wandering blindly through the cycle of rebirths called samsara. Chapter 2 gives an account of the Buddha's descent into this world. He comes as the one person who appears out of compassion for the world, whose arising in the world is the manifestation of great light. We follow the story of his conception and birth, of his renunciation and quest for enlightenment, of his realization of the Dhamma, and of his decision to teach. The chapter ends with his first discourse to the 5 monks, his first disciples, in the Deer Park near Varanasi. Chapter 3 is intended to sketch the special features of the Buddha's teachings, and by implication, the attitude with which a prospective student should approach the teaching. The texts tell us that the Dhamma is not a secret or esoteric teaching, but one which shines when taught openly. It does not demand blind faith in authoritarian scriptures, in divine revelations, or infallible dogmas, but invites investigation and appeals to personal experience as the ultimate criterion for determining its validity. The teaching is concerned with the arising and cessation of suffering, which can be observed in one's own experience. It does not set up even the Buddha as an unimpeachable authority, but invites us to examine him to determine whether he fully deserves our trust and confidence. Finally, it offers a step-by-step procedure whereby we can put the teaching to the test, and by doing so, realize the ultimate truth for ourselves. With Chapter 4, we come to texts dealing with the first of the 3 types of benefit the Buddha's teachings is intended to bring. This is called the welfare and happiness visible in this present life. Dittha Dhamma Hitasukha, the happiness that comes from following ethical norms in one's family relationships, livelihood, and communal activities. Although early Buddhism is often depicted as a radical discipline of renunciation directed to a transcendental goal, the Nikayas reveal the Buddha to have been a compassionate and pragmatic teacher who was intent on promoting a social order in which people can live together peacefully and harmoniously in accordance with ethical guidelines. This aspect of early Buddhism is evident in the Buddha's teachings on the duties of children to their parents, on the mutual obligations of husbands and wives, on right livelihood, on the duties of the ruler toward his subjects, and on the principles of communal harmony and respect. The second type of benefit to which the Buddha's teaching leads is the subject of Chapter 5, called the welfare and happiness pertaining to the future life. Samprayika Hitasukha. This is the happiness achieved by obtaining a fortunate rebirth and success in future lives through one's accumulation of merit. The term merit, punya, refers to wholesome kamma, Sanskrit, karma, considered in terms of its capacity to produce favorable results within the round of rebirths. I begin this chapter with a selection of texts on the teaching of kamma and rebirth. This leads us to general texts on the idea of merit, followed by selections on the three principal bases of merit, recognized in the Buddha's discourses: giving, dana, moral discipline, sila, and meditation, bhavana. Since meditation figures prominently in the third type of benefit, the kind of meditation emphasized here as a basis for merit is that productive of the most abundant mundane fruits, the four divine abodes, Brahma Vihara, particularly the development of loving kindness. Chapter 6 is transitional, intended to prepare the way for the chapters to follow, while demonstrating that the practice of his teaching does indeed conduce to happiness and good fortune within the bounds of mundane life. In order to lead people beyond these bounds, the Buddha exposes the danger and inadequacy in all conditional existence. He shows the defects in sensual pleasures, the shortcomings of material success, the inevitability of death, and the impermanence of all conditioned realms of being. To arouse in his disciples an aspiration for the ultimate good, nibbana, the Buddha again and again underscores the perils of samsara. Thus, this chapter comes to a climax with two dramatic texts that dwell on the misery of bondage to the round of repeated birth and death. The following 4 chapters are devoted to the third benefit that the Buddha's teaching is intended to bring: the ultimate good, paramatha, the attainment of nibbana. The first of these, chapter 7, gives a general overview of the path to liberation, which is treated analytically through definitions of the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path, and dynamically through an account of the training of the monk. A long sutta on the graduated path surveys the monastic training from the monk's initial entry upon the life of renunciation to his attainment of arahantship, the final goal. Chapter 8 focuses upon the taming of the mind, the major emphasis in the monastic training. I here present texts that discuss the obstacles to mental development, the means of overcoming these obstacles, different methods of meditation, and the states to be attained when the obstacles are overcome and the disciple gains mastery over the mind. In this chapter, I introduce the distinction between samatha and vipassana, serenity and insight, the one leading to samadhi, or concentration, the other to panna, or wisdom. However, I include texts that treat insight only in terms of the methods used to generate it, not in terms of its actual contents. Chapter 9, titled Shining the Light of Wisdom, deals with the content of insight. For early Buddhism, and indeed for almost all schools of Buddhism, insight or wisdom is the principal instrument of liberation. Thus, in this chapter, I focus on the Buddha's teachings about such topics pivotal to the development of wisdom as right view: the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases, the 18 elements, dependent origination, and the 4 noble truths. This chapter ends with a selection of texts on nibbana, the ultimate goal of wisdom. The final goal is not achieved abruptly, but by passing through a series of stages that transforms an individual from a worldling into an arahant, a liberated one. Thus, Chapter 10, The Planes of Realization, offers a selection of texts on the main stages along the way. I first present the series of stages as a progressive sequence. Then I return to the starting point and examine 3 major milestones within this progression: stream entry, the stage of non-returner, and arahantship. I conclude with a selection of suttas on the Buddha, the foremost among the arahants, here spoken of under the epithet he used most often when referring to himself, the Tathagata. The origins of the Nikayas. The texts I have drawn upon to fill out my scheme are, as I said above, all selected from the Nikayas, the main sutta collections of the Pali Canon. Some words are needed to explain the origin and nature of these sources. The Buddha did not write down any of his teachings, nor were his teachings recorded in writing by his disciples. Indian culture at the time the Buddha lived was still predominantly pre-literate. The Buddha wandered from town to town in the Ganges plain, instructing his monks and nuns, giving sermons to the householders who flocked to hear him speak, answering the questions of curious inquirers, and engaging in discussions with people from all classes of society. The records of his teachings that we have do not come from his own pen or from transcriptions made by those who heard the teachings from him, but from monastic councils held after his parinibbana, his passing away into nibbana, for the purpose of preserving his teaching. It is unlikely that the teachings that derive from these councils reproduce the Buddha's words verbatim. The Buddha must have spoken spontaneously and elaborated upon his themes in countless ways in response to the varied needs of those who sought his guidance. Preserving by oral transmission such a vast and diverse range of material would have bordered on the impossible. To mold the teachings into a format suitable for preservation, the monks responsible for the texts would have had to collate and edit them to make them better fit for listening, retention, recitation, memorization, and repetition, the 5 major elements in oral transmission. This process, which may have already been started during the Buddha's lifetime, would have led to a fair degree of simplification and standardization of the material to be preserved. During the Buddha's life, the discourses were classified into 9 categories according to literary genre: sutta, prose discourses; geya, mixed prose and verse; vyakarana, answers to questions; gatha, verse; udana, inspired utterances; itivutaka, memorable sayings; jataka, stories of past births; abhutadhama, marvelous qualities; and Vedala, catechism. At some point after his passing, this older system of classification was superseded by a new scheme that ordered the texts into larger collections called Nikayas in the Theravada Buddhist tradition, Agamas in the North Indian Buddhist schools. Exactly when the Nikaya Agama scheme became ascendant is not known with certainty, but once it appeared, it almost completely replaced the older system. The Kulavagga, one of the books of the Pali Vinaya Pitaka, gives an account of how the authorized texts were compiled at the first Buddhist council, held 3 months after the Buddha's parinibbana. According to this report, shortly after the Buddha's death, the elder Mahakassapa, the de facto head of the Sangha, selected 500 monks, all arahants or liberated ones, to meet and compile an authoritative version of the teachings. The council took place during the rains retreat of Rajagaha, modern Rajgir, the capital of Magadha, then the dominant state of Middle India. Mahakassapa first requested the Venerable Upali, the foremost specialist on disciplinary matters, to recite the Vinaya. On the basis of this recitation, the Vinaya Pitaka, the compilation on discipline, was compiled. Mahakassapa then asked the Venerable Ananda to recite the Dhamma, that is, the discourses, and on the basis of this recitation, the Sutta Pitaka, the compilation of discourses, was compiled. The Kulavagga states that when Ananda recited the Sutta Pitaka, the Nikayas had the same contents as they do now, with the suttas arranged in the same sequence as they now appear in the Pali Canon. This narrative doubtlessly records past history through the lens of a later period. The agamas of the Buddhist schools, other than the Theravada, correspond to the 4 main Nikayas, but they classify suttas differently, and arrange their contents in a different order from the Pali Nikayas. This suggests that if the Nikaya Agama arrangement did arise at the First Council, the Council had not yet assigned suttas to their definitive places within this scheme. Alternatively, it is possible that this scheme arose at a later time. It could have arisen at some point after the First Council, but before the Sangha split into different schools. If it arose during the age of sectarian divisions, it might have been introduced by one school and then been borrowed by others, so that the different schools would assign their texts to different places within the scheme. While the Kulavaga's account of the First Council may include legendary material mixed with historical fact, there seems no reason to doubt Ananda's role in the preservation of the discourses. As the Buddha's personal attendant, Ananda had learned the discourses from him and the other great disciples, kept them in mind, and taught them to others. During the Buddha's life, he was praised for his retentive capacities and was appointed foremost of those who have learned much. Itadaggam, Bahusutanam. Few monks might have had memories that could equal Ananda's, but already during the Buddha's lifetime, individual monks must already have begun to specialize in particular texts. The standardization and simplification of the material would have facilitated memorization. Once the texts became classified into the Nikayas or Agamas, the challenges of preserving and transmitting the textual heritage were solved by organizing the textual specialists into companies dedicated to specific collections. Different companies within the Sangha could thus focus on memorizing and interpreting different collections, and the community as a whole could avoid placing excessive demands on the memories of individual monks. It is in this way that the teachings would continue to be transmitted for the next 300 or 400 years, until they were finally committed to writing. In the centuries following the Buddha's death, the Sangha became divided over disciplinary and doctrinal issues, until by the 3rd century after the Parinibbana, there were at least 18 schools of sectarian Buddhism. Each sect probably had its own collection of texts regarded more or less as canonical, though it is possible that several closely affiliated sects shared the same collection of authorized texts. While the different Buddhist schools may have organized their collections differently, and though their suttas show differences of detail, the individual suttas are often remarkably similar, sometimes almost identical, and the doctrines and practices they delineate are essentially the same. The doctrinal differences between the schools did not arise from the suttas themselves, but from the interpretations the textual specialists imposed upon them. Such differences hardened after the rival schools formalized their philosophical principles in treatises and commentaries expressive of their distinctive standpoints on doctrinal issues. So far as we can determine, the refined philosophical systems had only minimal impact on the original texts themselves, which the schools seemed disinclined to manipulate to suit their doctrinal agendas. Instead, by means of their commentaries, they endeavored to interpret the suttas in such a way as to draw out ideas that supported their own views. It is not unusual for such interpretations to appear defensive and contrived, apologetic against the words of the original texts themselves. The Pali Canon. Sadly, the canonical collections belonging to most of the early mainstream Indian Buddhist schools were lost when Indian Buddhism was devastated by the Muslims that invaded northern India in the 11th and 12th centuries. These invasions effectively sounded the death knell for Buddhism in the land of its birth. Only one complete collection of texts belonging to one of the early Indian Buddhist schools managed to survive intact. This is the collection preserved in the language that we know as Pali. This collection belonged to the ancient Theravada school, which had been transplanted to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BCE, and thus managed to escape the havoc wrought upon Buddhism in the motherland. About the same time, the Theravada also spread to Southeast Asia, and in later centuries became dominant throughout the region. The Pali Canon is the collection of texts the Theravada regards as words of the Buddha. Buddhavacana. The fact that the texts of this collection have survived as a single canon does not mean that they can all be dated from the same period, nor does it mean that the texts forming its most archaic nucleus are necessarily more ancient than their counterparts from the other Buddhist schools, many of which have survived in Chinese or Tibetan translations as parts of entire canons or, in a few cases, as isolated texts in another Indian language. Nevertheless, the Pali Canon has a special importance for us, and that is so for at least 3 reasons. First, it is a complete collection, all belonging to a single school. Even though we can detect clear signs of historical development between different portions of the canon, this alignment with a single school gives the text a certain degree of uniformity. Among the texts stemming from the same period, we can even speak of a homogeneity of contents, a single flavor underlying the manifold expressions of the doctrine. This homogeneity is most evident in the 4 Nikayas and the older parts of the 5th Nikaya, and gives us reason to believe that with these texts, allowing for the qualification expressed above, that they have counterparts in other extinct Buddhist schools, we have reached the most ancient stratum of Buddhist literature discoverable. Second, the entire collection has been preserved in a Middle Indo-Aryan language, one closely related to the language, or more likely the various regional dialects, that the Buddha himself spoke. We call this language Pali. But the name for the language actually arose through a misunderstanding. The word Pali properly means text. That is, the canonical text as distinct from the commentaries. The commentators refer to the language in which the texts are preserved as Pali Bhasa, the language of the texts. At some point, the term was misunderstood to mean the Pali language, and once the misconception arose, it took root and has been with us ever since. Scholars regard this language as a hybrid, showing features of several Prakrit dialects used around the 3rd century BCE, subjected to a partial process of Sanskritization. While the language is not identical with any the Buddha himself would have spoken, it belongs to the same broad linguistic family as those he might have used and originates from the same conceptual matrix. This language thus reflects the thought world that the Buddha inherited from the wider Indian culture into which he was born, so that its words capture the subtle nuances of that thought world without the intrusion of alien influences, inevitable in even the best and most scrupulous translations. This contrasts with Chinese, Tibetan, or English translations of the texts, which reverberate with the connotations of the words chosen from the target languages. The third reason the Pali Canon has special importance is that this collection is authoritative for a contemporary Buddhist school. Unlike the textual collections of the extinct schools of early Buddhism, which are purely of academic interest, this collection still brims with life. It inspires the faith of millions of Buddhists from the villages and monasteries of Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Southeast Asia to the cities and meditation centers of Europe and the Americas. It shapes their understanding, guides them in the face of difficult ethical choices, informs their meditative practices, and offers them the keys to liberation and insight. The Pali Canon is commonly known as the Tipitaka, the 3 baskets or 3 compilations. This threefold classification was not unique to the Theravada school, but was in common use among the Indian Buddhist schools as a way to categorize the Buddhist canonical texts. Even today, the scriptures preserved in Chinese translation are known as the Chinese Tripitaka. The 3 compilations of the Pali Canon are the Vinaya Pitaka, the compilation of discipline, which contains the rules laid down for the guidance of the monks and nuns, and the regulations prescribed for the harmonious functioning of the monastic order. 2. The Sutta Pitaka, the compilation of discourses, which contains the suttas, the discourses of the Buddha and those of his chief disciples, as well as inspirational works in verse narratives, and certain works of a commentarial nature. 3. The Abhidhamma Pitaka, the compilation of philosophy, a collection of 7 treatises which subject the Buddha's teachings to rigorous philosophical systematization. The Abhidhamma Pitaka is obviously the product of a later phase in the evolution of Buddhist thought than the other 2 Pitakas. The Pali version represents the Theravada school's attempt to systematize the older teachings. Other early schools apparently had their own Abhidhamma systems. The Sarvastivada system is the only one whose canonical texts have survived intact in their entirety. Its canonical collection, like the Pali version, also consists of 7 texts. These were originally composed in Sanskrit, but are preserved in full only in Chinese translation. The system they define differs significantly from that of its Theravada counterpart in both formulation and philosophy. The Sutta Pitaka, which contains the records of the Buddha's discourses and discussions, consists of 5 collections called Nikayas. In the age of the commentators, they were also known as Agamas, like their counterparts in northern Buddhism. The 4 major Nikayas are the Digha Nikaya, the collection of long discourses, 34 suttas arranged into 3 vagas, or books, the Majjhima Nikaya, the collection of middle-length discourses, 152 suttas arranged into 3 vagas, the Samyutta Nikaya, the collection of connected discourses, close to 3,000 short suttas grouped into 56 chapters called Samyuttas, which are in turn collected into 5 vagas. The Anguttara Nikaya, the collection of numerical discourses, or perhaps incremental discourses, approximately 2,400 short suttas arranged into 11 chapters, called Nipatas. The Digha Nikaya and Majjhima Nikaya, at first glance, seem to be established principally on the basis of length. The longer discourses go into the Digha, the middle-length discourses into the Majjhima. Careful tabulations of their contents, however, suggest that another factor might underlie the distinction between these 2 collections. The suttas of the Digha Nikaya are largely aimed at a popular audience and seem intended to attract potential converts to the teaching by demonstrating the superiority of the Buddha and his doctrine. The suttas of the Majjhima Nikaya are largely directed inward, toward the Buddhist community, and seem designed to acquaint newly ordained monks with the doctrines and practices of Buddhism. It remains an open question whether these pragmatic purposes are the determining criteria behind these 2 Nikayas, or whether the primary criterion is length, with these pragmatic purposes following as incidental consequences of their respective differences in length. The Samyutta Nikaya is organized by way of subject matter. Each subject is the yoke, samyoga, that connects the discourses into a samyutta or chapter. Hence the title for the collection, the connected samyutta discourses. The first book, the book with verses, is unique in being compiled on the basis of literary genre. It contains suttas in mixed prose and verse, arranged in 11 chapters by way of subject. The other 4 books each contain long chapters dealing with the principal doctrines of early Buddhism. Books 2, 3, and 4 each open with a long chapter devoted to a theme of major importance, respectively, dependent origination, Chapter 12, Nidana Samyutta, the 5 aggregates, Chapter 22, Khandha Samyutta, and the 6 internal and external sense bases, Chapter 35, Salayatana Samyutta. Part 5 deals with the principal groups of training factors that, in the post-canonical period, come to be called the 37 aids to enlightenment, Bodhipakkhya Dhamma. These include the Noble Eightfold Path, Chapter 45, Magga Samyutta, the 7 factors of enlightenment, Chapter 46, Bojjhanga Samyutta, and the 4 establishments of mindfulness, Chapter 47, Sati Patthana Samyutta. From its contents, we might infer that the Samyutta Nikaya was intended to serve the needs of 2 groups within the monastic order. One consisted of the doctrinal specialists, those monks and nuns who sought to explore the deep implications of the Dhamma, and to elucidate them for their companions in the religious life. The other consisted of those devoted to the meditative development of insight. The Anguttara Nikaya is arranged according to a numerical scheme, derived from a particular feature of the Buddha's pedagogic method. To facilitate easy comprehension and memorization, the Buddha often formulated his discourses by way of numerical sets, a format that helped to ensure that the ideas he conveyed would be easily retained in mind. The Anguttara Nikaya assembles these numerical discourses into a single massive work of 11 nipatas, or chapters, each representing the number of terms upon which the constituent suttas have been framed. Thus, there is the chapter of the ones, Ekakanipata, the chapter of the twos, Dukkhanipata, the chapter of the threes, Tikkanipata, and so forth, up to and ending with the chapter of the 11s, Ekadasanipata. Since the various groups of path factors have been included in the Samyutta, the Anguttara can focus on those aspects of the training that have not been incorporated into the repetitive sets. The Anguttara includes a notable proportion of suttas addressed to lay followers dealing with the ethical and spiritual concerns of life within the world, including family relationships, husbands and wives, children and parents, and the proper ways to acquire, save, and utilize wealth. Other suttas deal with the practical training of monks. The numerical arrangement of this collection makes it particularly convenient for formal instruction, and thus it could easily be drawn upon by elder monks when teaching their pupils, and by preachers when giving sermons to the laity. Besides the four major Nikayas, the Pali Sutta Pitaka includes a fifth Nikaya, called the Khuddaka Nikaya. This name means the minor collection. Perhaps it originally consisted merely of a number of minor works that could not be included in the four major Nikayas. But as more and more works were composed over the centuries and added to it, its dimensions swelled until it became the most voluminous of the five Nikayas. At the heart of the Khuddaka, however, is a small constellation of short works composed either entirely in verse, namely, the Dhammapada, the Theragatha, and the Therigatha, or in mixed prose and verse, the Suttanipata, the Udana, and the Itivutaka, whose style and contents suggests that they are of great antiquity. Other texts of the Khuddaka Nikaya, such as the Patisambhidhammaga and the two Nidesas, represent the standpoint of the Theravada school, and thus must have been composed during the period of sectarian Buddhism, when the early schools had taken their separate paths of doctrinal development. The four Nikayas of the Pali Canon have counterparts in the Agamas of the Chinese Tripitaka, though these are from different early schools. Corresponding to each respectively, there is a Dirghagama, probably stemming from the Dharma-guptaka school, originally translated from a Prakrit, a Madhyagama and Samyuktagama, both stemming from the Saravastivada school and translated from Sanskrit, and an Ikotaragama, corresponding to the Anguttara Nikaya, generally thought to have belonged to a branch of the Mahasangika school and to have been translated from a dialect of Middle Indo-Aryan or a mixed dialect of Prakrit with Sanskrit elements. The Chinese Tripitaka also contains translations of individual sutras from the four collections, perhaps from still other unidentified schools, and translations of individual books from the minor collection, including two translations of the Dhammapada, one said to be very close to the Pali version, and parts of the Suttanipata, which, as a unified work, does not exist in Chinese translation. A note on style. Readers of the Pali Suttas are often annoyed by the repetitiveness of the texts. It is difficult to tell how much of this stems from the Buddha himself, who, as an itinerant preacher, must have used repetition to reinforce his points, and how much is due to the compilers. It is obvious, however, that a high proportion of the repetitiveness derives from the process of oral transmission. To avoid excessive repetitiveness in the translation, I have had to make ample use of elisions. In this respect, I follow the printed editions of the Pali texts, which are also highly abridged. But a translation intended for a contemporary reader requires still more comprehension if it is to avoid risking the reader's wrath. On the other hand, I have been keen to see that nothing essential to the original text, including the flavor, has been lost due to the abridgment. The ideals of considerateness to the reader and fidelity to the text sometimes make contrary demands on a translator. The treatment of repetition patterns in which the same utterance is made regarding a set of items is a perpetual problem in translating Pali suttas. When translating a sutta about the 5 aggregates, for example, one is tempted to forego the enumeration of the individual aggregates and instead turn the sutta into a general statement about the aggregates as a class. To my mind, such an approach risks turning translation into paraphrase and thereby losing too much of the original. My general policy has been to translate the full utterance in relation to the first and last members of the set, and merely to enumerate the intermediate members separated by ellipsis points. Thus, in a sutta about the 5 aggregates, I render the statement in full only for form and consciousness, and in between have feeling, perception, volitional formations, implying thereby that the full statement likewise applies to them. This approach has required the frequent use of ellipsis points, a practice that also invites criticism. When faced with repetitive passages in the narrative framework, I have sometimes condensed them rather than use ellipsis points to show where text is being elided. However, with texts of doctrinal exposition, I adhere to the practice described in the preceding paragraph. I think the translator has the responsibility, when translating a passage of doctrinal significance, to show exactly where text is being elided. And for this, ellipsis points remain the best tool at hand.